Somehow it's 2025 already. It really feels like the last year just flew by. Honestly, I didn't build nearly as much as I wanted to, so this year I'm setting myself a goal to just build more. More kingdoms, more temples, pyramids, just honestly more of everything. To keep myself on track, I've started this brand new world. The plan is to fill it with all sorts of random builds over the year. Whenever I'm in the mood to just chill and work on something, I'll jump in here, fire up the replay mod and just build whatever I feel like building. Right now it's completely empty, so let's kick things off with my first build of 2025. While I look for a good spot to start building, let me tell you what I've got in mind for today. You know how some people have comfort foods? Well, I've got comfort builds. You know, the themes that you've built so many times that they're just fun and relaxing to build now. For me, that's medieval. I can just shut my brain off and place blocks, and normally it works out. Now, I'm hoping to try some new themes in this world later, things I've never built before. But to start the year, I figured I'd go with something familiar. I'm thinking of a medieval town. Something cozy with a lot of character. Nothing too planned though, I just want to make it up as I go and see what happens. I think I've managed to find the perfect spot. There's plenty of space, a nice mix of terrain, it will do perfectly. I can already picture the town split into two halves, connected by a bridge in the middle. This is going to be a lot of fun to build, but let's get started by cleaning up the terrain a bit, just so that I can properly build on top of it. I've actually noticed that there are quite a lot of mobs on the island. While I adjust for terrain, they'll probably end up dying, and I don't want to be responsible for murder, and so we're going to temporarily move them. Later on, we can build some kind of barn in the town for them to live in, but for now, this small island will do. I'll even add some fences so that they don't go missing. Oops, I guess one casualty out of 20 isn't that bad. We'll probably have to add a grave for this guy somewhere in the town too. To make the terrain more easily, we're going to be using a few mods, like Wild Edit, Voxel Sniper and GoBrush. I'm going to start by using a brush that changes blocks to air, which is masked to all of the plants on the ground, so that when we later on smooth out the terrain, they won't get in the way. We'll be adding our own plants at the very end anyway. But with them all gone, let's move on to deleting the trees. I could use commands for this as well, but because of my destructive tendencies, I find it quite therapeutic to just do it by hand. One tree down, only a bunch more to go. The sound of leaves breaking has to be one of the most satisfying sounds in the game. This might seem a bit odd, but the next step I'm going to take is draining the ocean around the island. I want to work on shaping the terrain a bit, and the water will get in the way, but we'll add it back in a minute. But so that we can shape the island more easily, I'm going to switch it to gold blocks as a placeholder. This way, when we're using commands, we'll be able to shape it just like Play-Doh. First up, I'm going to use Voxel Sniper to smooth everything out, which will make it a lot easier to add houses and paths later on. We can always manually add some smaller hills at the end, in between all of the houses and the other structures. I'm also using a blendable to just raise up terrain in areas, so we can get rid of random holes in the caves where there was water or cave entrances below. Now that we have a flatter canvas to work on, I'm going to start building up a couple of cliffs. I'm thinking it would be cool to have a castle on this back island, which is atop a bunch of cliffs. Having it all the way back here means that it would look nicely over the town at the end, and offer some great views. We can then smooth down these cliffs. I personally prefer to really over smooth things, but I know that most people like to leave them quite rugged. Let's now get on to painting everything. To start with, we can switch everything to grass, and then use the normalize command, which will basically turn any grass that is under a block of grass into dirt or stone. We'll start the painting with stone, making the cliffs look a lot more rocky instead of just being these big green spikes. We can probably also add back in all of the water now, just so that it's easier to picture where the water level is. We removed an absolute ton of water, so it might take a while for it to all load back in. It's been 2 minutes, but we finally have water again. And now that it's back, we can add in some sandy beaches to spots on the terrain. I want to make sure that I don't add too much, just so that the build doesn't look too tropical. But having a couple of sandy spots just helps to add variety. And while we're at it, we can also just clean up the edges where the grass and stone meet on the cliffs. And maybe add in a couple of splatters of grass on the cliffs so that they're not too grey. The castle itself will probably be very grey, and so I want to avoid it being too bland once we're done. We're going to need to figure out a block palette to replace the stone with, and so I'm thinking we could use some regular stone and mossy cobblestone. Maybe mixed with some ores, which I always like to use. I'm not too sure if I should use iron or copper. I think I'll go with iron though. And then we'll also maybe want some mossy stone bricks. And then finally some andesite, which always goes well with stone. And I'm actually also going to use some tuff, just so that there's a slightly darker block in the palette too. We can now just paint all of the stone with this new gradient, which should help make it look a bit more textured and less one-dimensional, especially the cliff. I'm actually going to add in a couple of rocks to really make it look less flat. I'll especially add these around the coast. If you're wondering, I'm just using a rock brush with a couple of different sizes of rocks. I'm going to also just go around and add these on the other island too. We can then paint these just like we did with the rest of the terrain, so that everything fits together nicely. And then the very last step before the terrain is finished, I just want to add some vegetation. We'll begin by just using the Flora command to cover everything with plants. I'll remove the cacti and dead bushes that it created. And now we can use the brush to make small pockets of alliums all around. The purple of these should really help to add a bit more colour to the terrain. But with that, the terrain is good to go. So let's move on to building the first area in the town. I can already picture in my head having a windmill over here, surrounded by farms, and so I'm going to begin with that. I build a lot of windmills, so I'm going to try and speed through it, as you're probably sick of watching me build them by now. Let's begin with the base of the windmill. I'm going to use cobblestone and stone bricks for this. We can start by just forming a pretty simple circular shape, and then I'll build up a bit of a frame for us to fill in. I'm just going to fill this in with some cobblestone for now, and some andesite around the top layer. I'm going to just expand this up a bit with some lodestones, and then form a kind of viewing platform on the top which will work as a balcony. To make it a bit safer up here, we can use some lecterns around the edges to work as a fence. They're a bit thicker than fences, so I think they'll look better for this build. And we can add some lanterns so at night time you don't fall off. I'm really liking how this is looking already, but let's now build up the second layer of the structure, which should be the main living space. I'm once again going to make it circular, I think, but instead of using stone, I'm going to switch to a wood-based palette, with some oak logs functioning as the main pillars. I think it would be cool to fill it in with some looms. The back texture of these look really cool. I actually first saw these being used as a building block in a Pearlescent Moon video. The best way to learn about blocks you can use and techniques is definitely by watching YouTube building videos. I've since been addicted to using looms to build with. And now let's just top this part off with a roof, which curves inward slightly to make a slightly domed shape. We can even add some fences so it blends a bit better with the wood layer below. Building windmills is pretty much like building a wedding cake. We're just going up layer by layer. The next part is probably the most important layer though, as it will be the main tower. Unlike the rest, this part won't be circular. Instead, it's going to be a big rectangle. We can start by just building up a frame with some stripped spruce logs. And now we can fill in the gaps with some beehives, which give a nice wood plank texture. I'm actually going to just expand it up 1 or 2 more blocks so we have more height to work with. Okay, now let's add some details so it's a bit less bland. Adding a couple of windows should sort that issue. We can use some scaffolding for the actual window frames. It doesn't function very well as it's not a solid block, but we're just going for looks. And then we can frame these windows using trapdoors and a gate to make a window frame. And then add some buttons as well for decoration, as well as a flower pot in front to add some colour. Instead of adding an allium, I'm going to just go with a pink tulip, just because we used alliums in the terrain. And then let's cover the other surfaces of the grass as the dirt underneath looks a bit ugly. We could use some birch to do that with, so we're not using the same oak and spruce throughout the whole build. And I'm just going to copy this design onto every window. It looks good, but a tiny bit flat, and so I'm just going to add some spruce stairs into the walls to add a slight bit of depth. And now I really like that, so let's move on to the top part of the windmill. I'm going to just use some dark oak wood to create stairs that jut out at the top of the tower. We can then build a frame on top of that for the top room. This is basically just going to be a simple rectangular shape. We're not going to add too much detail as the blade of the windmill will cover most of this up anyway. And now let's add in a very standard roof. And then we can fill in the walls with some beehives and finally add a couple of windows. Like I said in my last video, where I surprisingly also made a windmill, the hardest part is going to be building the blade. It's really hard to get the shaping right, but I'm going to try my best. Okay, this is looking awful. I can try to maybe thicken up the blades, which might make it look less bad. Nope, I'm just going to delete this and start again. In fact, I'm going to build these in a completely different style, starting with a wooden frame and then we'll add the wall at the end. This looks a lot better now and I quite like it. I do think though that the positioning could be a bit better, so I'm going to quickly use WorldEdit to copy it, and then we can come over here and paste it. I'm thinking we can have a slight hill around it, all covered in farms. I'm actually going to build the terrain around it by hand, just as I think it will look a bit nicer that way. When you build terrain by hand, it often looks better for smaller sections of terrain like this. The only downside is that it's a lot more time consuming to build. I'm going to skip ahead here just because it's quite a boring process. And now that it's done, let's add a couple more rocks. And now we can cover the entire area in farmland. I want to leave a few small patches of grass around the edges where the farmland kind of fades into grass, so there's less sharp of a transition. Before I add in the crops, let's add some paths which will help divide the crop types. I'm going to use wheat for the big main farm, which is the most recognisable crop in the game and my favourite to build with. We can use carrots for this small section of the farm on the right side, and then let's have some potatoes at the back along the riverbed. I might expand these out later so they go further down the island too. This is looking great, but I think we can add a few small features to tie everything together better. I'm just going to add in a couple of broken walls around some of the edges of the farm, just to break the farms up a bit, as well as adding in some leaves around the edges of the paths so that they stand out a bit better. We can also add in some small scarecrows. I always use this design when I build a farm. They're super easy to make but add a lot of character. And then finally, just to add some extra texture, I'm going to just splatter in some mud into the paths, which will make them look a bit more worn out and messy. Now is probably a good time to design some trees, as we could use a couple of them around the farm. I'm just going to make 2 or 3 oak designs for now. Once they're done, we can save them as schematics, which means we can use them as much as we want around the island. As long as we rotate them around, you won't really be able to tell that they're being reused. I recently actually watched a short from B-Dubs on how to build trees. I'm normally okay at building them, but I took a couple of tips from the short, like using walls in the design to work as thicker sections of branches. I'm also using some fences and gates to work as branches and twigs too, just making them as messy as I can. Now that I have the branches all done, we can use a brush to add some leaves. Now we have all the leaves down, just to add some contrast, I'm going to switch some of them to birch leaves. And then finally, I'm going to just scatter these gold blocks along the top of the leaves, and also clean up a couple that look out of place. And then we can use this Wild Edit command to replace the gold blocks with grass, ferns and poppies, to add some extra dimension and colour. I've repeated the process 2 more times, but slightly smaller to make some other trees. I'll now delete these and save them as schematics, and then we can place them around the farm. Let's add 1 over here, 1 here and 1 here, and some bone meal around the area just because I forgot to add grass to this island. But with that, we have the first proper area finished. I think that now would be a good time to move on to the other half of the island. Before we get to building lots of houses, I want to start with a barn. I know I want to add one at some point, and it makes the most sense for it to be right next to the windmill. I don't really plan to make it anything too special. It's probably just going to be a standard rectangular building, and so this base shape should be fine. Let's now just build up the walls a bit using some tuff, and then mix some copper ores in with the tuff for some texturing. And then we can expand it up a few blocks with cobblestone. I think that keeping the walls pretty flat would be good. The houses will have a lot more shape to them, so to make this identifiable as a barn, I'm just going to keep it flat. Let's now use some trapdoors to add a couple of windows, and then once again a very standard roof. We can use spruce wood to outline where the roof will be, and then fill it in with some deep slate slabs. We can even add an outline of tiled deep slate slabs just to make it less boring. These trapdoors on the edges of the roof should also help to add a bit more of an interesting shape, without being too over the top. It's the small details that really help to tie a build together, but if we add too many, then it will look messy. Adding these mud brick walls should be fine though to help outline the shape a bit more. Now that we have our very basic barn done, let's move on to the side to add a small stable for the animals. This will be super quick and easy to build. There we go. That small addition on the side of the barn makes it look a lot more complete. We can then tie this small area together by adding a second area for the mobs to live in over here, just built using some logs. I'll make sure to go around and use some spruce slabs on the lower logs just so that the mobs can't escape. I'll work on transporting the mobs from earlier into this once we're done with all the building, just to make sure that they don't die. Hopefully they're still safe on their island. If some mobs have killed them after all the effort I went to move them, I'm gonna be really mad. And now let's expand our paths out a bit. And then finally, I went around and added some plants and some of our tree schematics. This is what it now looks like. There's not as much room left for the village as I was hoping for, but we can squeeze some houses in still. It just means that I'll have to be more creative with how I position everything, which is always a fun challenge. I'm going to start by adding a couple of walls to mark out where the town will be, and raise up a platform of land for the houses, so that there's a bit more room to build on. And there we go, all the walls are now here. I was going to add a time lapse there, but I forgot to press record on the replay mod, sorry. But basically, we now have this main area which is walled off, with an opening at the back where it will link to the castle. There's also this extension down here which is where the docks are, so we can squeeze in some extra houses and markets, and maybe even add some ships later. I haven't yet added a way into this area though, so let's just build a quick entrance in this wall that links up to the main path. And now that people can enter, we can start building up a few houses. Just like the trees, I'm going to just design a couple and then we can copy and paste them around the area. There's not much room, so we don't need too many houses. The pallet will be pretty similar to the barn, with this stone base that then leads into a wooden frame. Just like the windmill, we can use a couple of stairs to add a bit more dimension. And then let's add some beehives to the main walls. I'm not sure what to use for the windows. Let's try out scaffolding. I like the colour, but I think bamboo trapdoors would be a better fit, as they're more flat and have a more detailed texture. I'll probably just reuse the same kind of roof that we used on the barn, as it makes the most sense. We can use dark oak slabs though for the outline this time, as it will add a bit more contrast. And then I've just added this slight pattern on the roof, using different types of deep slate slabs, which makes it look more tiled, which I personally prefer over using a random gradient. But with that, our first house is done. Actually, I'm going to just extend it a bit on the side to add some extra shape, with this small attachment that can work as the main entrance to the house. Let's add a door, and now our first house is done. The extra bit of shape helps to make the house look much better. I'm now going to just quickly go over the next houses as a time lapse, as the process is quite repetitive. I used the same general shape on each house though, and the same block palette so that they'd fit in the same village. If I switched the design up too much, then they would look odd next to each other. And the same goes for if the scale was too different on any of them. I did make one larger design though, which would work as more of a community house, where a load of people could live. It's not too much bigger than any of the others, but it's big enough to stand out a bit. This was probably my favourite design of all the houses, as I spent a bit longer on the detailing and roof design. But with that, we now have our 4 houses finished, which should be more than enough. I'm now just going to delete them and save them as schematics, and then we can place them all around the area. I'm trying to be strategic with how I place them, so that they can fit together snugly, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. I don't want it to be too crowded or too open. I'll also add in a couple of pathways as I go, so we can plan where the houses go around that. Because we've got so many dirt paths, I'm actually going to switch a couple of the most walked on paths to be gravel instead. As this area is really lived in, I want to make the paths look a bit more permanent and man-made, rather than just being dirt tracks. And then I'm quickly going to just design a large tile, which we can copy and assign to a clipboard brush to allow us to paste it down all along the ground where there's gravel, which just helps to give the ground a much nicer texture. I'll quickly just fence off the paths and once again add a lot of bone meal. We should really try to give plazas like this a bit more character, so that the town isn't just paths and houses. And so I'm going to just build a small fountain here. I'm keeping the design really simple so that it doesn't stand out too much, but it does the job just fine. And now that it's built, let's of course add some water. There we go. Another great decoration to add to a town is some sort of market stalls. I don't want to add too many as there will be more in the dock area, but we'll add a couple over here. This market stall is going to be selling melons, and so we can just add a bunch of melon blocks around it. And this one is going to be selling pumpkins, so we can obviously add some pumpkin blocks around it too. But just with those small additions, this area already looks much nicer to live in. I also want to just go around and add some barrels and pots, which are being transported around the area, which really makes the town look more lived in once again. Over here, let's add a tree to break the path up a bit. And I've had a really cool idea, which is pretty rare, but let's add some apples to the tree to give it more character. We can just place down a bunch of item frames on the leaves with apples inside of them, and then run this command while standing near each, which will turn the item frames invisible, so it looks like the apples are just hanging on the apple tree. To really tie this into the area, let's go ahead and add some apples on the ground underneath the tree, where it looks like they've fallen from the tree. Just with that one small detail, this area already looks much nicer. We can also add some other trees around the area too. And now let's have a quick look of how it's coming together. I hope you like it, as I really like how it's come together. The only thing that I think it's lacking is a bit of kinetic energy. You know, some kind of movement. And so what I'm going to do to fix that is just add a couple of chimneys on some of the houses. All we need to do is literally just build up some 3x3 towers on the roofs, which look slightly broken up, and then place a campfire inside. In some chimneys, we can even place a hay block on top of the campfire, which will just make the smoke that comes out a bit stronger. And with that, I would say that this main town area is done. Next on, I want to move on to the small area at the front, which we'll use as the docks. I really want to cram quite a lot into this small space. It's going to be an area used for a lot of trading, and we'll also have some houses for the poorer citizens of the village, built using less sturdy blocks. Before I get to the smaller houses that people will live in, I want to begin by building 2 larger structures which can work as a main indoor trading hall, and a kitchen to cook up any fish that's caught. I'm going to start by just outlining where the 2 buildings will be, with some oak logs, and then we can start filling these in. I'm actually going to have these houses built into the main wall that's behind them. We can use mossy cobblestone and mossy stone bricks to really make them look like they're taken care of, less than the houses inside of the walls. For the second level, I'm actually going to use some jungle wood. It's kind of the same as oak, but more decayed, and it looks like it's lost its colour due to all of the water from the sea splashing onto it. These structures won't be repaired and maintained like the ones inside of the main town, and so I want to really make them look more weathered. And I'll just use some acacia trapdoors for the windows. These bamboo buttons also look quite nice on the walls. They kind of look like wooden nails that help to hold the building together. While I've built the walls of each house up the same, I want to give each structure a unique roof. Both will be using bamboo blocks and hay blocks though. I want to use hay blocks as it can tie in with the farm that we built at the start, with the hay from there being reused to build these kind of thatched roofs. But with that, we now have both of the buildings done. I'm now going to quickly just build a couple of smaller houses around them, where fishers and other workers can live. These houses are much smaller, but each would just house a family or 2, so they don't really need to be big. I'm just using the same kind of block palette as the larger houses, switching up the roof design for each house to make them look less planned and more just quickly scrapped together. And with those all built, I'm now just going to scatter around some barrels again, using even more here as there would be plenty being exported in and out of the docks. I also just quickly added in a market stall here in between the 2 larger structures, which has loads of furnaces to cook fish for people to buy. Moving down to the lowest level of the docks, I'll also just add a ton of barrels. People in this town really like barrels. To finish this area off, I also just want to expand out a few platforms coming off the lower levels. These will be used to get on and off the ships that come to the town. I'm going to keep the designs very straightforward, just making them straight with some fences along the sides to keep people safe, and a couple of lanterns to light it up at night. I also added another over here, just to help lower any crowds and allow for higher throughput of people getting on and off the island. I really don't want to build a boat, but I kind of have to or it will just feel like it's missing. I complain a lot about building boats and claim to never really make them, but I've built quite a lot of them lately. To mix things up, I'm going to make more of a ship than a boat. Now that I have the general shape done, I'm just going to build up the edges slowly, edging it outwards as it goes up. I can even mix in some stairs to help get the shape right. And now that the base is built up, we can add a couple of lecterns along the edges to work as banisters. I'm actually going to raise the back section up, kind of like a pirate ship. We can even squeeze a room inside of this back section if we really want to. Let's add some windows in case we add a room in here later. And now that we have the bottom of the boat done, I need to add some kind of sails. I'm just going to build up a couple of poles for them to attach to. And then attached to them, we can create a platform which the sails will join onto. So that they look a bit more realistic, I want to add a slight curve in the center of the sails, where it looks like they're picking up wind. Even if the ship isn't moving, there'd still be some wind which blows into them, so we need to make sure they don't look too flat. It's not great, but it does the job. I'm now going to just make a smaller version on the back pole now. And we can even add some small flags coming off the top of the poles. Finally, let's connect all of the poles and sails using some fences. Looking at it from afar, I think it could do with a bit more texturing on the sails. And so I'm just going to mix in some white concrete and mushroom stems to make them look a bit more worn. This is probably one of the better boats that I've ever built. I'm still for sure a boat amateur, but it could be a lot worse. Let's copy this boat around the island now, just like we did with the trees and the houses. I want to have them mostly around the docks, but we can have a couple further away too. And then finally, to make each feel a bit more unique, we can add some random cargo on each, which each ship is exporting or importing. This ship can be a honey ship, not like the sketchy Chrome add-on, but like actual honey, with barrels of it and some honeycomb as well. We can also very quickly throw some ores onto the ship to turn it into a very expensive jewel importer. And then finally, I'll chuck some random flowers onto this boat that look like they're being brought into the town from a faraway island. And now that we have the docks done, as well as the entire town, I think it's time to take a look back at everything from afar. You might have spotted that I added a couple of broken walls which come off from the town, which I just thought I'd add as a bit of lore, like they used to wrap around the farm but decayed over the years and got left. If you have any name ideas for this kingdom, please do let me know in the comments, as well as any suggestions of what I could add. I really hope you don't mind, but because I spent a lot longer on this build than I planned to, I'm going to instead split this into 2 videos. And so next week, I'll move on to the other island and finally build the castle, as well as some other final touches like adding interiors, as well as some of your suggestions from the comments. Please consider leaving a like and subscribing so that you don't miss that video when it comes out. I hope you have a great day and a great year. Goodbye.